So here we are again. I mean, you guys have seen the news Nevada put out. So a couple, again, low-level positive M3 metabolites for Jon Jones. Not going to affect the fight this Saturday. You know, as I was talking about it this morning, I've been on the phone with Andy Foster, State of California Executive Director, Bob Bennett, Executive Director, John's camp, his attorney internally here with the UFC, and all of us are of the opinion, well, this is, you know, it's not great that every time Jon fights, an issue like this comes up. However, based on the amount of testing that he's had over this last 2 months, these recent low-level positives are the best evidence I think we've seen of what these experts are telling us, and that is no re-administration of this substance and no performance-enhancing benefit. You know, we now have, I'm just looking at Nevada's release, you have, you know, 2 very low-level picogram positive bookended by 2 negative tests within, you know, a week and a half. If there was re-administration of this substance, you would clearly see the parent compound, you would see short and mid-term metabolites, which science has shown would be in existence for several weeks. So again, while unfortunate for Jon, I think that, you know, based on the level of the amount of testing, it's the best evidence that I've seen. I was counting the entities that are testing Jon right now. I've never, in the history of my experience in anti-doping, 15, 16 years, seen as many entities testing one athlete. He's got State of California individually on their own, who tested him at the California event. He's got VADA on behalf of California. He's got the Nevada Commission, which has done some tests on their own with an independent collector. He's got Nevada, who has done VADA testing, and then he's got USADA testing. So 5 different entities have tested him over the first 2 months of 2019. There's not been another athlete on the planet that's ever had that happen.
Jeff, to that point, why were only the NSAC tests the one that registered the positives? I mean, are these tests being applied or measured differently?
No, I mean, well, the reality is, while you have different entities doing the collecting, they're all going to the same laboratory, Smyrtle, Salt Lake City testing laboratory. They go to that laboratory with just a number, so there's nobody at the laboratory that knows that they're looking at Jon Jones's sample. So when you look at all those facts together and you know, kind of see the layout of these negative, positive, negative, again, it's really solid science evidence of what these experts have been saying all along.
And how about the dates, the 14th and 15th? As you said, bookended by clean tests. The theory, I guess, because we don't have exact science, is that the weight cut is what causes this pulsing. So why is it the 14th and 15th? What's the theory there as to why those show up and then afterwards it's not?
It's a good question. I just got off the phone with Jon's camp, and who told me that that period of time was when he was peaking in his training. So, you know, typically a fighter getting ready for a fight will, you know, gradually increase that intensity, peak, and then maybe a couple weeks out, taper off so that they're, you know, fresh for the fight. And that was right in the heart of when Jon, what his camp has told me, was peaking in his training for this fight.
And just one last question for me. I guess this is also kind of theory, but how long do we expect to keep seeing these results? Because I think people are concerned. I mean, is this a year, 2 year, 5 years, his career? How long do we expect to keep seeing these?
That's the million-dollar question. I don't think science knows right now. But again, as I've stated publicly, Jon's not the only athlete that this is happening to. Not the only UFC athlete, and then certainly there's athletes that I've talked to, other sports entities, professional sports leagues, that have had it happen to them too. So it's becoming quite common, and I think it's just a circumstance that level, the sensitivity level of testing over the last couple of years has increased 10, 100-fold. I mean, you're talking about, there's another professional sports league detected a 1 picogram quantity of that M3 metabolite. So I think pretty soon, and I don't even know what the next lowest measurement level is, but I think pretty soon you're going to start seeing that when they can detect 1 picogram. Again, I've laid out the example, grain of salt cut 55 million times. One of those pieces is a picogram. You can detect 1 piece out of 55 million. It's just an incredible sensitive level.
So Jeff, just to be as clear as we can here, because Jon has been tested so many times, I think 9 times since the fight, so almost once per week, if he were taking anything actively, it would have shown up in one of those tests because he's being tested so often. Is that not correct?
Correct. That's what every expert's telling me, and if you look back at the Rodchenko paper, the one guy that actually studied this and identified these compounds, he's identified short and mid-term metabolites that would be around for 2 to 3 weeks. And now throughout these 2 months, I don't think a week has gone by when he hasn't been tested. So to me, that's why this evidence now is so strong and so supportive that there was no re-administration of this substance.
Why was there a 10-month lull for USADA to test Jon while he was suspended?
So we're talking back, a year and a half ago. Yeah, that's an interesting, good question. So I think the first thing to note is, while you're right, there was, a gap when he wasn't tested. Jon didn't know that. Jon was still subject to testing. The UFC didn't know that. Nobody called him and said, you're not going to be tested for this period of time. USADA doesn't necessarily share, well, they don't share with the UFC their, testing plans or protocol. For good reason, in case anyone at the UFC could have, a favor or something. This is why the independence of this program is so important. There's no possibility that anybody could tip off a fighter for when they're going to be tested. So, that would be a better question directed to USADA. My guess would be they knew he was going to be suspended for a relatively long period of time. And, the reality is we only have a limited amount of tests. Are you going to devote, a lot of testing to someone who's not going to be fighting for a while and, with the plan of, hey, let's start, 6 or 7 months out really testing heavily? I'm guessing that was their plan, but that would be a better question directed to them.
Is that an incredible flaw in the program, though? You've got suspended guys that have, I guess, top 4 banned substances not getting tested for long periods of time. Shouldn't they be subject to more stringent testing rather than less?
Well, that's one thing that we looked at, and that's why we've increased our testing numbers. So I think the percentage is 40 or 50%. So we were about 2,800, for the first part of our program, and I think now we're 4,500 to 5,000. Hindsight's 20/20. But yeah, I think, going forward, certainly we've expressed to them that, just what you're saying, hey, when someone's out on suspension, they should probably be tested pretty regularly.
Yeah, I think the overall quantity is not as much the issue as seeing someone like Brock Lesnar tested once in Q1, Jon Jones tested twice in Q1. It just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense when you look at other athletes that have never had any sort of adverse testing get tested 4 or 5 times.
Yeah, again, although on the other side, I'd say look at when those athletes are fighting and look at the lead up to that fight and the several months to that fight. And I think most science has shown when you use a performance-enhancing drug and stop, the returns are diminishing, and that's why under our program, an athlete who retires on his own and gets back in is required to be in there for 6 months before they can fight. So I think 6 months is that magic marker that even if you use something, if you're off of it for 6 months, science has tended to show your returns are diminishing, if any, at the end of those 6 months.
So Jeff, this is over, I guess, a year and a half now that this long-term metabolite has been pulsing in Jon's system. Is there anything to be deduced about when that could have gotten in there, and also how much he could have ingested that could have kept it in the system for this period of time? Because it's a long time.
Yeah, I don't think we know that yet, and certainly, in the lead up to this last one, he had every incentive to try to find what contaminated supplement it was, because likely if he was able to definitively show that, there would have been mitigating circumstances that would have decreased that sanction. He couldn't, so what that tells me is, he doesn't know or can't figure out why it happened. But yeah, all those are great questions. It is one of the strangest compounds I've ever seen, again, in my 15, 16, 17 years of anti-doping. I've never seen one like this.
That initial violation in July 2017,
right.
At that point, everyone thought that this was something that he took relatively recently. But now, knowing what we know now, could it be something that he took in 2015 or 2014?
Great point. Yep, great point. That we don't know that it could immediately preceded that test. It could have been a year or 2 before that. There's just a ton of unknowns right now with how this metabolite acts. And again, I would remind everybody, never in the history of Jon's testing program has a parent compound that ever been found a short-term or a mid-term metabolite. It's always this long-term, strange-acting metabolite.
Has there been any effort by Jon and his team, or maybe USADA and you guys, to go back and look at maybe what Jon was taking, if it was a supplement or something back, even going back to 2015, 2014, before the USADA program, you can start to see what was the origin of this? Yeah,
I think it's safe to say that Jon and his team went over everything he did over the last 2 years with a fine-tooth comb trying to find out how this happened. And it's been unsuccessful.
You mentioned that Grant Dawson is another UFC fighter who went through something similar. He was cleared by USADA eventually after investigation. And I believe you said recently too that there was someone else going through the same thing. Are you able to say who this fighter is?
No, not now. Although eventually we will. Everything will be transparent. Right I think for good reason. For cases like this, we changed our policy so that until the case is adjudicated, then we'll be transparent. But the reality of what was happening is, fighters that weren't doing anything intentionally were, labeled as cheaters. Now, it's not to say that there's strict liability in our program. Our program is more than just not taking prohibited substances. You've got to be, and this case exemplifies that more than any, you've got to be super careful on what supplements you take, what prescribed medicine you're taking, almost what foods you're eating in certain countries when it comes to some meat contamination. So, John's team is probably as careful a team right now, ensuring that what goes in his system is okay.
And that unnamed fighter is also an oral treatable as the DHA, metabolite. It's the exact same thing, essentially.
Yep.
Okay.
Can I just ask as a point of clarity? The term double jeopardy has been used to explain why an athlete or John cannot be punished for the initial infraction and shall be punished. Is that an across-the-board policy?
Say it again.
Double jeopardy has been sort of used to explain why he was punished once, he can't be punished for that infraction again. Is that an across-the-board policy?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. It makes sense. You're not going to punish an athlete 2 times for the same activity. So yes.
That does vary though, depending on what jurisdiction and what body you're in. Because there's also strict liability that some leagues have where there is something found in someone's system.
True, and I don't think his question was about strict liability. It was if say you punish someone, as John was, for strict liability.
Right.
If that is still showing up after a year or 2 and there's no evidence that there was re-administration, you wouldn't punish them again under the strict liability provision. That's across the board, absolutely.
You mentioned he hasn't had anything aside from a long-term, a long-term test. Does that include UFC 200?
Say that one more time.
The positive test for UFC 200. I think that was for clomiphene.
Those were different substances.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then,
and you can go back. There's a publicly released arbitrator decision in that case, 40, 50 pages, which lays out all the facts in that case. The science was definitively able to show that it came from a tainted medication that he took. One he probably shouldn't have. He was punished for it. But again, in that case as well, no evidence exists that he intentionally did anything.